recording. All right, everyone. Welcome today to Campus Climate Core Day 9. Ooh, it's quite a week so far, ladies and gentlemen. Lots to talk about today. So we're just going to go ahead and get straight into the material. So what actually happened at COP 26 today? It's Gender Equality Day, actually. During the prior to COP, when they're organizing the conference, at least 2 days of COP is usually dedicated to gender equality. And today there was a powerhouse of a woman on stage, Nicola Sturgeon. She is currently the First Minister of Scotland and head of the SNP, the Scottish National Party. Her party advocates for Scottish independence and is, based on her own qualifications, quite a big supporter of gender equality in general and in women equality on the international front, especially on climate change specifically. She did say that there is no doubt we must ensure that climate change is a feminist issue, and that we must make sure that the experiences of women and girls across the world, so often disproportionately impacted by climate change, are understood as we devise the solutions. And we must make sure that the voices of women are at the center of creating and implementing the solutions to climate change. She gave an actual fantastic presentation today, probably a little bit better than even our own representatives did, mostly because her panel today was with a variety of women, actually. One was from the Maldives, as one of the first women councillors ever elected to their own local government. So that was fantastic to hear from her. And that kind of discourse and dialogue that she had was also fantastic, given the fact that Nicola Sturgeon herself is the first woman elected to the prime minister position, or the first minister position of Scotland within the United Kingdom. Our own Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was today at COP. These photos were from today, where she went up on stage and discussed some elements of the Build Back Better program. She said that the Build Back Better program recognizes the interconnectedness of climate change and gender justice that enables women and girls to lead a just transition to clean energy economy of the future. I feel it was really important that Nancy Pelosi get up and speak. Not only is she a woman, but she is the Speaker of the House. She oversaw the House of Representatives transition from the bill from the Senate over to the House of Representatives, and then sent the bill off to the president. So she played a very large role in ensuring that the Build Back Better program stayed true to what it promised, and added some language within the Build Back Better program to ensure that women get equal access, and then gender equality is represented within the Build Back Better program that Biden has been pushing for the last few months. And next, okay, of really important note that I feel that was released today, Oxfam and other COP delegates today are expressing unease about the lack of progress made in discussions. Given the fact this is currently within week 2 of COP, right? This is during the time when negotiations are at their height. The biggest of the world leaders have probably already left for their countries. Boris Johnson has gone back to London. Biden has gone back to the USA. Modi has gone back to India. So now we're at the height of negotiations. Secretaries are talking, delegates are talking. How are we going to ensure that the countries are living up to their expectations? And there's definitely a sense of unease at COP today, because now we're in the middle of week 2, going into the middle of week 2, and we don't have a lot to show for it. So COP delegates are expressing a lot of unease at the lack of their progress made in these discussions. And one quote that we have from Tracy Carty, who is a climate change policy and advocacy lead at Oxfam. She said, everything is still set to play for, but there's a long way to go. In other words, we're admitting that we're in the week 2, we don't have much to show for it, but the game is not over yet. So there's still time for public pressure from Extinction Rebellion, from the outside forces. There's still time for the inside forces to capitalize on the fact that there's still 4 full days left of COP. Climate Action Tracker, or better known as CAT, compounded the sense of unease by saying that pledges to cut methane, coal, and protect forests made at COP26, or in other words, the main promises made today at COP26, will only change the temperature by a few tenths of a degree. So temperatures are still on course, or actually are on course, to reach at least 2.4 degrees Celsius higher by 2100 as compared to pre-industrial levels. And again, this is by one of the most major climate action centers, Climate Action Tracker. And this is still with the information, the flawed accounting data that many countries are reporting, which really just goes to show that we're going to hit 2.4, if not even higher at this point. Which again, goes back to the concept of us needing to be in the streets, to us be outraged. Why aren't we even angrier at the major promises that are not being kept at COP? So again, the concept that, we'll leave this first segment off today is, still keep with that study hard, protest harder. And we'll leave off a little bit today with a video that we took from Extinction Rebellion. They kind of blocked the entrance of getting into the COP event today. And I think it's really cool to show how they broke off, or how they protected, or how they protested at the event today, which was completely peaceful, no throwing of anything, no one was hurt. In fact, this is the way that Extinction Rebellion chose to just to show their protest. Really cool, in my opinion. The lead director of this is actually a Scottish Gael himself. Had the whole kilt on and everything, playing his musical instrument, blocking the entrance to the venue. The police didn't want to seem to get involved too much on this front, but I think it just goes to show that they're planning for peaceful protest was really, really, I think, inspirational, and they did a really good job of it. Anyway, John, I'm going to turn now over to you. You have screen sharing capability, so if you want to take over your segment, go for it.
Well, thank you, Rock. I attended several sessions today, and I thought I would provide some notes on those. In addition to it being the gender theme today, it was also the science and technology theme today. This is the only day of the COP that has two themes. So I covered the science and technology. Let me bring up some photographs. All right, so I started my day at the Methane Pavilion, and they had a fairly in-depth discussion of the need and some of the methodologies of removing methane from the atmosphere and reducing the leakage from various sources. I didn't stay very long at this pavilion. Next to it was the Russian pavilion, and I visited there. They weren't really having a science and technology discussion. They were having a finance discussion about investing in technology. And they were discussing primarily nuclear projects. So very clearly, the Russians and the Chinese are planning to make major investments on new nuclear technologies. The United States, of course, developed many of the technologies that they're discussing, particularly the molten salt reactors, which the Chinese will embark upon very soon. I don't know that the Russians are planning on using the molten salt technology, but they're clearly committed to additional nuclear. But they were also discussing investments in wind and solar. And I went over to the Morocco pavilion. They were talking about agricultural implications of climate change. Morocco, being a fairly arid nation, has significant vulnerabilities on that front, and their discussions focused upon how they could best prepare to deal with the stresses that climate change will place upon their food production. Nearby, I went over to the water pavilion. They too were discussing similar topics, the stresses of climate change upon water, and then its implications for not only drinking water supplies, but for agricultural production. What I noticed was, whereas I'm a member of Waterkeeper Alliance, a traditional environmental group that is participating in this climate conference with priorities for defending and protecting the existing ecosystem, most of the conversations were sort of assuming that the natural ecosystem is going to be heavily impacted and that national priorities will not be focused upon minimizing the effects upon the environment, but rather trying to minimize the most tragic implications for the populations. So implicit in a lot of these discussions is that the natural ecosystem will continue to degrade and very severely. The moderator in this particular session was fairly aggressive. She ruled the session with an iron fist and was very demanding of frank answers from the panelists. Many of the panelists come from a diplomatic background, or they are officers within nonprofit organizations accustomed to dealing with donors and funding groups, and very measured in their language. This woman was having none of that. She insisted upon frank answers to hard questions, and when a panelist tried to evade or be polite in their responses, she was quick to insist upon a more forthright response. I found that interesting. Went over to the French exhibit, and they were talking about reducing the carbon footprint on the livestock sector, on the cattle industry. Now, it's a difficult concept to deal with, particularly since they were looking toward a fairly unambitious goal of 15% within 10 years. And the fundamental sort of fallacy in discussing reductions or marginal reductions in the cattle industry is that the entire cattle industry is really a largely a severe problem. Of course, some livestock on a landscape is essential for certain ecosystems, and since we've decimated the natural grazers on these landscapes, the cattle are a required substitute at this point. But the truth is, when you talk about the meat industry, the energetics of producing meat are pretty severe. As we know, a person can bring in calories and protein into their body from either meat sources, or they can do this from plant sources. And the plant sources are obviously more efficient relative to the energy and the overall consumption of resources than are the animals, than are the livestock. So reducing the impact of the cattle industry by 15% is a very marginal ambition, given that the cattle industry represents a 10-fold increase in energy consumption over plant-based nutrition. Went over to the South Korea pavilion. They too were talking water and technology today. And in this session, they were discussing purification of water, of salt water. And they were also discussing some of the technologies for that, some of the membrane technologies. So I found it interesting. I've worked in the utility sector also, and this issue of reclaiming water that is not currently or presently suitable for human consumption through the application of energy and technology is a fairly common approach in Florida, but it needs to become much more widespread. And I think this will be a secondary benefit of our transformation of the energy system. As we move away from fossil fuels and into new energy technologies, I believe that we're going to not only replace our current energy consumption patterns. In other words, replace 1 kilowatt of fossil fuel with 1 kilowatt hour of renewable energy. But I think that by driving down the costs of renewable energy technologies, we are going to set the stage for our ability to command much more energy for human purposes. And that will help alleviate some of the stresses that will follow from the climate change implications, the stresses upon agriculture, stresses upon human water supplies. And it will do this by providing the energy basis for cleaning up these undrinkable, unusable water sources into a form that we can make use of. And the Koreans, if you were listening to our discussion last night, are notable in that they invest much more of their GDP in research and development than does any nation, with the exception of Israel. Israel and South Korea invest nearly 5%, upwards of 4.5% to 5% of their GDP in research and development, whereas the United States is down at about, I think, 2.8, and the global average is around 2. So South Korea is an example of a nation that is trying to invest in solutions. I went over to the Turkish exhibit, and they were having more of a traditional environmental discussion. They were describing an aquatic ecosystem off their southern coast and its biodiversity and the values that it provides. And within the climate change context, biodiversity is often described as having value in its carbon sequestration capacity, particularly seagrasses that grow in either freshwater or saltwater systems have the ability to take up an awful lot of carbon. So whether we're talking about land ecosystems or aquatic ecosystems, within the climate change discussion, it's important that the environmental advocates highlight the carbon sequestration potential for these systems. Now, of course, these systems are going to be under stress due to climate change, but it will be important to maintain their functionality, particularly on the carbon uptake side of the equation. Then went to the US Center, and they had some particularly good presentations today. I found them extremely informative and enjoyable. The US Center, this is the first year in several that we've had a US Center officially representing the national administration, the executive branch. There's a second, it's called the US Action Center. And during the Trump years, when we did not have an official US Center, we had the US Action Center that was organized by the cities and several of the nonprofits. But at today's US Actions, or at the US Center, the first discussion was about research and development, basically technologies that are necessary to be either deployed or created to help address the needs of solving the climate issue. Now, the first speaker was a woman from the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency and I think that's based in Switzerland. The moderator was a science advisor for the White House. And the first speaker from the IAEA talked about two sets of goals, the 2030 goals and the 2050 goals. 2030 goals are to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 55% by 2030, and to be carbon neutral by 2050. And they said that both of these depend upon technology, obviously. The 2030 goals are dependent upon existing technology or largely existing technologies that are either already being deployed or that are in the final stages of scaling up from the laboratory into commercialization. Now, the 2050 goals, however, many of these are still in their infancy, the technologies that will be necessary to achieve those goals. They talked about atmospheric carbon capture as well, and that is fairly new. Typically, when nations talk about meeting their climate change objectives, they talk about reducing their emissions. They talk about switching over from fossil fuels to low carbon fuels. Seldom do you hear them say, well, we also need to begin extracting carbon from the atmosphere, but that was placed on the table here at this session. They also stated that some of the administration goals included by 2035 having fully eliminated any and all investment in fossil fuel based industries. And that's a pretty bold statement, even though it's still 15 years away. They also said that by 2035, the entire automobile industry should have eliminated and simply be selling new vehicles that are electric, not be selling any combustion engine based vehicles by 2035. The second speaker was an assistant secretary in the Department of Energy, and he talked about the Department of Energy embarking upon an Earth shot, and an Earth shot being analogous to the moonshot that we pursued in the 1960s. And he obviously emphasized research. He said the Department of Energy is primarily about research. He said that they had one success in their previous efforts. They had established a goal of reducing the cost of solar energy, of solar photovoltaics, by 75% by 2020. And they said they actually, when they embarked upon that program, I think in 2010, they achieved that goal by 2017, so ahead of schedule. And of course, they weren't the only player in that. Other nations, particularly with their production capacity, helped achieve that, because driving down the cost of a new technology or an underdeveloped technology isn't just about coming up with new methodologies for the basic principles involved in that technology. It's also about, and probably more about, driving down the actual production costs through efficiencies in operations and streamlining methodologies at the factories. They said the next Earthshot priorities the Department of Energy was establishing were threefold. One is the development of hydrogen power, of using hydrogen as a transport mechanism for renewable energies. In other words, wind, solar, and other energies are used, to split the water molecule and produce hydrogen gas, which is compressed and transported as a liquid fuel. Now, the second priority in this Earthshot is long duration energy storage, what we might describe as just batteries. Now, they said long duration for them is 10 hours or more. Short duration is 4 hours-ish. The reason that this is a priority is because of a lot of the technologies, the renewable energy technologies we're relying upon now and scaling up are intermittent, the wind and solar. So there needs to be an improvement in energy storage technologies. And their goal there is to reduce the cost of that by 90%. That's fairly ambitious. And the third goal is to develop these carbon negative technologies. Now, when the Department of Energy starts establishing carbon negative as a priority, it's telling you that they have concluded that eliminating our current fossil fuel releases isn't enough. that we are going to have to extract the carbon that we've already released into the atmosphere. One, because nations like the United States that may have greater industrial capacity and investment capacity might reach carbon neutrality much sooner than other nations. So to have the entire planet reach carbon neutrality will require that we deploy carbon extraction systems from the atmosphere. The third speaker was about people-centered approaches for sustainable development goals, and he was from the European Union. He talked about the 2030 goal of 55% reduction and the 2050 goal as well. He also talked about enhancing the sinks for carbon in our system, and that's what I was talking about before, particularly the soil carbon, what's typically called carbon farming when it comes to agriculture, and then preserving the ecosystem so that our natural areas can continue to take up carbon. And then, of course, the blue carbon, the carbon taken up by the ocean in the form of seagrasses. He also emphasized the carbon capture technology and that research and development is essential in that. The fourth speaker was a diplomat and a scientist. He talked about mission innovation. And this is the first time I've heard a US government official talk about mission innovation. It was something that came out of the 2015 Paris Agreement to double the research and development investments of the participating nations in renewable energies. And of course, Trump withdrew us from that agreement, including the mission innovation. But the speaker was describing the momentum that had already been put in place within the Department of Energy, such that the mission innovation goals were largely achieved despite the Trump administration's de-emphasizing that program. Also talked about the First Movers Coalition, which is a consortium of 34 large companies that have committed to bringing what are currently economically non-viable technologies to the market, driving down the costs, making them economically feasible for purchase in the open market. He said it's important for the government agencies to send the demand signals. In other words, by government agencies making purchases of what are initially expensive technologies, they can help drive down the costs very rapidly. They also talked about sticking with the competitive model. In other words, having these technologies serve as a competitive advantage for US companies in the global marketplace. And while that is a noble ambition and consistent with our capitalistic system, it's uncertain whether or not this particular challenge of climate change will allow us to adhere to that old business model. We may have to be somewhat more liberal in our permitting foreign nations to access the technologies that we develop. These can't all be revenue centers. They cannot all simply be driven in their pricing by maximizing profit. We have to maximize deployment. The last speaker on this particular panel was Mona Never, and she is also a science advisor in the administration. She talked about the 2030 goals as well and said that we have 2/3 of the technologies necessary to reach those goals. But on the 2050 goals, she said only 1/3 of the technologies are currently in hand. We also talked about the need for students to be trained in not only science, but in science communication, because not only must the scientific imperatives be communicated to the public and the politicians to gain support, but technically trained professionals are going to have to talk to other technically trained professionals in other disciplines. And the science communication is essential in being able to work together in the teams across disciplines. So that was a very good session. I enjoyed it, particularly because it emphasized education every step of the way. Now, later in the evening, starting at 6 p.m., there was a session offered by the American Society of Civil Engineers and NOAA. And this ties back to some work that Rock and I had done actually back in 2019. This was discussing the need for data, primarily weather data, that serves as the foundation for many of our industries in the United States, whether it's the tourist industry, whether it's commuters simply getting to work each day and knowing what they're going to confront in their travels, or if it's something more direct, such as farmers planning their growing season and their irrigation schedules and so on. Then he also talked about the nuts and bolts of the NOAA operations relative to data collection and data services. He talked about how a traditional service provided by NOAA is to tell people in various industries what to expect in a normal year. And that allows them to prepare or at least plan their operations with some degree of certainty, or at least being able to bracket the risks. So this is primarily for agriculture, the energy industry, and infrastructure as well. One of the speakers emphasized how reliant our society is upon what is normal, and deviations from normal are beginning to take a serious toll on our economy. Talked about how in this year alone, in the first 9 months, natural disasters that exceeded a cost of $1 billion, that there were 18 of them already in 2021. And there was some comparable number in 2020. So the deviations from normal weather patterns are beginning to take an extremely high economic toll on the United States, as it is on other nations. Then they talked about some of the lesser impacts, the insidious effects of climate change, the nuisance impacts of minor flooding and inconveniences. We talked about how to make our system more resilient, how to assess its current state of vulnerability. And that involves assessing what exposure is to be expected in the future and the sensitivity of our various elements of the infrastructure, and then beginning to design resilience based upon that. Talked about the engineering challenges, particularly the codes and standards. When people go to build a road, build a house, design a farm, there's certain codes and standards that govern this process. And engineers are taught the methodologies that are used within these codes and standards. And then there are certain values and boundaries placed upon that. And this is all predicated on knowledge of the natural system and what to expect. And these are not stable any longer. So they're talking about how they're going to have to evolve their codes and standards and their methodologies, and how they're going to have to integrate this into the university education of the new engineers and scientists. Talked about how the science and researchers need to develop the new methodologies in concert with the engineers and the policymakers. What was most dramatic was this engineer talking about how failure is no longer an if, but a when, and how badly the new structures and systems being designed today will fail. And the reason for this is that they are based upon old codes and standards that assume certain weather patterns and water conditions and wind conditions. And those old standards, those old norms are no longer applicable. So they admitted the need to both evolve the systems and assess risk, but they also talked about how they were going to have to evolve the methodologies, the techniques, the statistical methods that go into, say, predicting flooding. Whenever you purchase a house, you have to get flood insurance if you're in a particular flood zone. And the statistics that go along with those classifications are no longer valid. And that's called non-stationarity. So a stationary system is where the statistics developed over the past 100 years of data would be assumed to be applicable in the next 100 years. But with a shifting climate, that's no longer the case. Therefore, you have to use fundamentally different types of statistical models and predictors for extreme events. And civil engineers really do not like having to use methodologies that are not tested and in which confidence has not been long established. But these engineers had a very frank discussion about how they are going to have to embrace these uncertainty models and accept the variability that comes with that uncertainty and the risks that come with that uncertainty. So they're preparing themselves for a fundamentally new way of developing their codes and standards. And this was a very unique conversation. And I tie this back to the 2019 conference where I invited Rock to speak about environmental performance bonds. The speaker, I believe before or after him, was addressing this issue of non-stationarity. And this individual was the top simulation modeler for the South Florida Water Management District, basically the top computer modeler in the state of Florida for natural systems. And he was pointing out how the statistics no longer held true. And after his presentation, I asked him, okay, when are you going to develop the new methodologies and the new statistics? And his response was, well, we're not going to do it. There's no foundation for being able to do that with any great confidence. We're not really authorized to deviate from these old methods. So he kind of left us hanging here. And this session by NOAA and the American Society of Civil Engineers was the first indication that they're getting over that initial shock and inaction, that they are now prepared to embrace new methodologies, as imperfect as they may be, but using these to make better predictions so that we can have safer designs for our infrastructure in the future. So the last session I attended was by NASA about Arctic sea ice melt. And I don't have much notes and photographs from that session, so I'm going to skip that and maybe revisit it tomorrow. So Rock?
Wonderful. Thank you very much for showing the sessions that you attended today. And we do have a couple questions. One is when you were talking about nuclear, Peyton asks, can you see a world where the US invests in molten salt reactors? And although I think that question will be asked or answered tomorrow when we broadcast, or possibly even Thursday, when we broadcast our interview with Sebastian Rivolet, who is one of the lead folks advocating for nuclear here at COP. I'm sure John has some info on that one for you, but yes, on smaller grids where there are potential capacity to transform previous coal power plants, where we would like to phase out coal and instead of destroying or instead of selling or even misusing some of the coal infrastructure that would used to have transported the energy from the coal power plant to the rest of the grid, we might instead be able to use a lot of that infrastructure with the new molten salt reactors, using small module reactors as well. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the United States has already invested in molten salt reactors, and we invented them back in the 1960s. We just didn't scale it up. We didn't pursue the technology any further. But given that the Chinese have committed to pursuing this technology, I think it's fairly certain that the United States will as well, if for no other reason than to, it's instinctive to compete with your primary rival. So nothing gets the US government beyond uncertainty, hesitation than a good old-fashioned Cold War rivalries. But that's not to say that we would be scaling up these technologies. We would probably build a prototype power plant somewhere and then explore improving the various elements of this. And when the time is right to scale up the technology is a difficult thing to say, but it's essential that we continue to invest so that we have command of the technologies and the ability to scale up when there's a clear advantage to doing so.
Great question. Another question we have from Facebook, from Mark, asks, when you were attending the U.S. Center, did they host folks specifically from the wind and solar industries, or were these American delegates and representatives talking about these points from their point of view?
The officials particularly in the Department of Energy, typically have some direct experience in the industries. One of the speakers in the panel was an engineer with the California Utility Company, not the Northern Utility Company, but the Southern one. And he was the one blazing a trail on all this very innovative risk assessment. And he pointed out that his utility was the first utility to embrace such a holistic and an aggressive risk assessment and mitigation program. And that's obviously because their power company to the north, neighbor, had suffered so terribly through the fires that their equipment had contributed to starting. So the panels did include industry people, but I'm not sure if any of the Department of Energy people had experience directly in the photovoltaic or the wind turbine industry.
Great. Zeta asks, what is the difference between Nancy Pelosi and Nicola Sturgeon's speeches at COP today? Excellent question. Nicola Sturgeon made some very specific points on what Scotland is doing to integrate women into the workforce, into the government, into climate proposals. And given that Scotland is a leader on the world stage in terms of percentage of energy coming from renewables, I don't think that there's a lot more to say here than that she's done a very impressive job leading Scotland in that direction. But more specifically, they're creating programs that, as Scotland is ramping up their renewable energy capacity and creating jobs in the renewable sector, they are putting preferential treatment on the education of women to prepare them for these jobs that are being created in Scotland, these renewable energy jobs that are being created in Scotland. On the other side, Nancy Pelosi gave what I would call the regular politician's approach to empowering women in politics and in climate change. In other words, we're pursuing a path that there is a potential that they're going to be pushing out together. Nancy Pelosi said they're going to add some additions to the Build Back Better program to allow for women empowerment in politics and in climate change. But she didn't make any specific references to what that meant. Whereas Nicola Sturgeon gave some very concrete examples of what Scotland's doing, some very specific numbers on how Scotland is doing that right now. Nancy Pelosi did not make that argument whatsoever. She did not give specifics on that argument whatsoever. Okay, are there any other questions from Facebook Live or Zoom? Please feel free to throw them at us right now while we still got time. And
I'd like to make a suggestion.
Sure.
Now, you did a question and answer session today with your class back in Gainesville. Maybe you could tell folks a little bit about the class, which course it is, and what you presented to them and some of the questions and reactions from your fellow students.
Sure. So a lot of what, well, in order to get away with coming to COP, I think it was necessary that I offer to do that presentation to the class, but it's called IDS 2154, taught by Dr. Leslie Teal at the University of Florida. I'm currently a TA for that course. Dr. excuse me, Dr. Teal asked me to, excuse me, come together or bring together a lot of the content that we've been collecting and broadcasting it to some of the students. Of course, the ultimate result of COP26, as it had been so far, is not that revolutionary. It is not that strong. It is certainly not that important when it comes to what we could have been doing if we actually put our minds to it. In other words, there's no really good news to send back home to some of these students who may have been hoping that COP26 was a light of a shining ray of hope. No, the result is even some of the stronger pushes, such as reducing methane emissions by 30% or ending deforestation by 2030. So much of that is just politicians' talk. So much of that is just politicians saying what they're going to say. I mean, for deforestation, are there going to be forests left anymore at 2032 chopped down, right? Or cutting methane, like what statistics, what carbon accounting methodology, or methane accounting, what methane accounting methodology are we using to prove that we're cutting our methane emissions by 30%? They're really just not so much good information to send home, let alone the big speeches by politicians last week, which we've heard every single year at each of these COP events. However, students were asking some very poignant questions, which I felt was pretty important, specifically what NGOs are doing as the closed door sessions are going on. So while the negotiating rooms have their closed doors, why aren't these NGOs allowed in to be able to talk and explain to some of these delegates some of the statistics and the facts and be able to participate and share and make sure that there's some accountability being held to these delegates as they are behind closed doors, as the public has no idea what's going on in these negotiation rooms. So their students were asking some really good and spot on questions regarding that, which I felt was extraordinarily important, especially given the fact that it's their futures that they are just now realizing are so important. Peyton says, I really appreciate how critical you are of COP26. It is really refreshing compared to some of these politicians. Yes, really, really good point. And I think this actually goes back to another question that was asked in class, which is, what is COP26 officially saying about their results? Which is, I think, an important point because it is the job of the UK presidency. Because remember, COP26, every single year, a new country takes over the presidency of it, which means they are in charge of it. It is to Boris Johnson's best ability, or it really is up to Boris Johnson to show how positive he is about this event, show some of the feathers in his cap as he moves into election season. And yes, Boris Johnson is trying to call for an early election in next February so that he can capitalize on a lot of the positives as a result of COP26 as he sees it, and the COVID-19 decrease in cases and triumph as he sees it. In other words, COP26 for Boris Johnson is just another feather in his cap as he moves into election, an early called election next year. So he's just trying to make a good job and a good name for himself. So his job is to make it be positive. His job is to say everything's positive, we're doing great. So yes, it is important to be critical of COP26 because it's our futures on the line here that they may not exactly lying about, but yes, they're lying about it. So bottom line is we're going to do our job here. We're going to call them out on their BS. We're going to share with you the information as we see it. And please keep asking these questions. Please keep interacting with us because it gives us a good idea of where we need to go tomorrow, the next day, to get that content that you really want. John, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the fact that it's number 26 and we're still talking about making some initial inroads into problems is I think, sufficient commentary on the record. The The United Nations is simply a forum for the nations to come together. If the collective nations are not ready to take dramatic action, the UN can't force them into anything. So failures at these COPs really reflect the failures of domestic politics in the respective nations, the United States particularly.
Yeah, that's exactly true. All right, it seems that there are, excuse me, no questions from Facebook Live or Zoom. If you have any last ones, throw them at us. John, do you have any closing remarks? Okay, sounds good. In that case, this is going to close out our day 9 briefing from Campus Climate Corps. We are signing off and see you all folks tomorrow. Have a good night, everyone.
Have a nice night.
Thanks, Peyton. Good night now.